Hello friends, I'm Joker. In today's tutorial video, I want to tell you all about the pivot point. The pivot point's fairly new, it's been around for a few weeks, but I found it very useful. This is what the pivot point looks like. This is a Maker Pen recreation of it. It's a white box with X, Y, and Z axes coming out of it that are red, green, and blue. You can view the pivot point when you're in edit mode on a Maker Pen shape. So I'm going to show that to you all right now. First, I need to turn off my streamer cam for this one, actually, because that's the way we can see while we're in edit mode. So, let's make a Maker Pen shape is the first step. Just gonna make an orange cube. Now, okay, so there's the pivot point. Viewing the pivot point, there's a setting for it which defaults to off. That is in your settings menu of the, open up your Maker Pen palette, go to the settings tab, and go to page 2, and there's a tick box that says show pivot. So, usually it defaults off, so when you create a Maker Pen shape like this, you're not going to see it, but anytime you have show pivot ticked, it'll show. So this is our pivot point. And so some basics of the pivot point. It appears at one corner of let me illustrate this. The pivot point appears at the first corner, like it appears in the first place you click your Maker Pen when you're creating a shape, when you're creating the first shape in an object. So if I click here and drag out here, it's going to appear at this corner because that's where I started. The other thing about it is the pivot point doesn't move around no matter what other shapes you add to your object. So I can add another cube. Let's make some spheres. So no matter where I add these other shapes within an object group, the pivot point doesn't move around. And currently there's no way to move the pivot point itself, like I can't grab it. I can grab the shapes with my hand. But what you can do if you want to relocate a pivot point within a shape that you've created, you can select all the shapes. This is tough. Sometimes, but you can select all the shapes and then just move them around. You move them relative to the pivot point. The pivot point stays put, but the shapes move. So now what I've got is a shape, which is over there, basically, but the pivot point stays here. And that's going to come up with... Okay, so let's move these back. That's going to be relevant to a problem I'm going to explain in just a little bit. The other thing to know for the basics of a pivot point is... the pivot point stays sort of local to the shape that you've created, right? So if I go into edit mode, I can see it's right about here right now. But if I move this shape to the left a little bit, and then go back into edit mode, the pivot point is part of the shape. It stays with the shape. So that's the basics of the pivot point. I'll explain in a little bit what is like the things it's specifically used for. But first, I want to talk about some problems with the pivot point. Maybe there's only one problem. So when you're within an object group and you select a shape and you split it out, the problem is it moves the pivot point of that shape to somewhere you wouldn't expect. So just to illustrate, let's make another sphere. So we've got some spheres in this shape, but I'm going to make it, when you create a new object, when you create a new shape like this, it's a totally independent object. So here's a totally new object, separate from that object. I'm going to recolor it, actually, just so we can keep track. So I'm going to edit mode. I can see when there's a sphere, the pivot point should be somewhere near it. So what you'd expect when you go into edit mode on a complicated object like this, and you select one of these spheres, if I select this and split, so now I'm still in edit mode on this, and this is a totally new shape, so I have to exit edit mode and go into edit mode on this new one. So since we just created a different sphere, I would expect the pivot point to be somewhere near this, but when I go in edit mode, what you can see is it's not there. So this is the problem. When you split a shape from an object group, Rec Room moves the pivot point to somewhere you wouldn't expect, and that place is the origin of the room that you're in. So the reason I'm here inside this brand new Maker Room is because when you come into a Maker Room, this is roughly where you spawn. It's right around this point, and we'll call it the 0 point of the map. You could call it the origin of the room. And that's how splitting works. It's sort of arbitrary and silly, but that's the way it works for now in Rec Room. And that's true no matter where. So let's see. Okay, let's delete this example. So if I go into edit mode in here, and I move another one of these shapes, outside here, and now I split it. Okay, that's split. Go into edit mode. Again, pivot point's not really anywhere near it, but if I go inside, I can see there's the pivot point. Again, right at the center of the room, which is the origin of the maker room. So this means if you're building somewhere that's 100 meters away from the center of the maker room, like most rooms will involve, and you're splitting shapes and stuff, you're creating pivot points that are really far away, and that's a problem for some reasons I'll get into a little bit later. So what you need is a way to fix. I call this a broken pivot point, and we need a way to fix that. So let's get to that right now. So, and remember, I'm going to move this right now. Like we went over just a minute ago. Oops. Even though this is in here now, I can get rid of this. Even though this is in here now, since I moved it, the pivot point moved with it. It was at the center of the room because I moved it into the room. Now the pivot point's way over here. So, we don't want this pivot point here. We want it near our shape. Or if it's a more complicated object, like usually you're splitting a bunch of shapes at once, it's the same thing. You're going to want to move the pivot point to the object. And here's the way to do that. I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to explain why it works. Step 1, make a dummy shape. I'll call it a dummy shape because I don't know what else to call it. So I usually use just something simple. It can honestly be anything, but I usually do, just for simplicity, a small neon cube, just so I can see it. And what you're going to do is place this dummy shape exactly where you want your pivot point to be. So I want this one to be just a little bit below that sphere. So you notice when I create this dummy shape, it, just like everything else, has its own pivot point, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that pivot point of the new shape. I'm going to take that and sort of give that pivot point to the object which is broken, which has the pivot point way over here. And the way I'm going to do that is, so step 1, create a dummy shape where you want the pivot point to be. Step 2, select the dummy shape first. Now that I've got that selected, select the object of which you want to fix the broken pivot point. Okay, now merge. Now if I go into edit mode, I can see the pivot point of, these are the same shape now, or these are the same object now. And if I go into edit mode, I can see I've got my object and I've got my pivot point where I want it to be, and I don't need this dummy cube anymore, so I'm just going to delete it. So here we are, same object, and now it's got a pivot point where I want it to be. So the reason this works is because when you merge two objects together, this is good to know in general, when you merge two objects together, the pivot point of the new object that you create is going to be the pivot point of the first object you select. So let me demonstrate that. Materials. So here's one object. Here's another object. So if I go into edit mode, I've got pivot point here. If I go into edit mode with this one, let's actually make it interesting and flip this upside down. Now I've got a pivot point down there. And if I, actually let's do this both ways just to really demonstrate. I want to make, there's two pairs of these now. So I'm going to do one way and the other way. So this one, select this first, select this second, merge. Now the pivot point's going to be up here because I selected this one first. With the second group, I'm going to select this one first and then this one second and merge. And now, if you remember, the pivot point's going to be down here. So it's always the first one. It's always the first one you select that gets the pivot point. So that is a quick and easy way to fix a broken pivot point on an object. Now, so the reason this is important, I'll just explain it. The number one right now is important right now. The animation gizmo just came out, which is pretty great. I haven't experimented with that too much, but I know people are saying that when you're animating an object, or when you're animating some objects, the objects within move around the pivot point. And if you have a pivot point that's really far from the object you're trying to animate, then it can move in really unpredictable ways. I'm not sure exactly how, but I know when you're messing with the animation gizmo and you're having problems like that, it's probably because you got a pivot point that's not where you need it to be, and you need to do what I just told you to put the pivot point where you want. The other problem we're more familiar with, this has been around a while, is shifting, which is also known as rotation compression. Let me explain the terminology for that a little bit so it makes a little bit more sense. So the reason it's called rotation compression usually is because the other name, what we used to call a pivot point before we had pivot points, is we called them the origin. What that means is sort of mathematically the 0 point of the object that we're dealing with, and that's how Rec Room deals with it. Okay, so when Rec Room is placing an object in your room, it looks to see where the 0 point is, and then it places the object at the rotation that you should have saved it at, based on that 0 point. And what rotation compression is you'll have little rounding errors or some kind of error in the rotation, and it'll be just a little bit off. And why that matters is if you have, so the way rotation works is the farther something is from the axis of rotation, a smaller rotation means it moves more. So if it's here and it rotates just a little bit, it's not going to be very noticeable. But if it's way out here from the pivot point and that pivot point rotates just a little bit, suddenly that's a big difference. And that's why when you have large objects, you get that kind of problem. But it's also, you also see the problem when you have a pivot point that's, so say I had this pivot point that's 100 meters this way, and there's a tiny rounding error in that pivot point. Or in the object, or in the origin. Now it's going to be the shapes within the object are going to be way offset. Okay, it might be a little bit more. I'm actually not sure whether it's the shapes itself or the whole object, but the point is, the farther your shapes are from the pivot point, the more you're going to see rotation compression and shifting, also known as shifting. The other part of that is, so the fix that I just explained with creating the dummy cube and merging them, that actually does cause a little bit of shifting, and I'll demonstrate. Before I started recording, I went up and did this. This is where you see shifting a lot. You've got two large shapes that are supposed to be somewhat aligned, and these I did not at all rotate these on this axis. But after I did, so I broke the pivot point on this lower one, and then I used the fix that I just explained, and that caused it to, the pivot point we can look at is where I put it. It's right down here. So I got the pivot point to where I want, but the problem is that when I was doing that, it rotated a little bit in a way I didn't really want. So the lesson you take from that is, if you're doing a fix on an object like that, do the pivot point fix before you place it where you want to place it. So now that I've, oops, okay, that's going to be complicated, so I'm not going to do that. But yeah, if you're placing large objects like that, do the fix and then place it. Then the pivot point will stay put, and it shouldn't you shouldn't have shifting again, other than the normal shifting you get in Rec Room, which usually happens when you have second players coming in and out of the room, and that's something for another video. So, thanks for watching. That's everything I know so far about pivot points, and I hope it helps you all out. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.